True Home Alone horror stories. The Thief and the Cursed Object. Jake Morrison is a notorious thief in the Seattle suburbs. He lives alone in an old house at the end of the street where he stores the spoils of his notorious robberies. No one knows much about Jake's past, but he is known for targeting valuables, jewelry, art, antiques. Jake has always been confident that he has the ability to read the value of objects, and has never suffered any consequences from his crimes. On Halloween night that year, Jake made a big heist, targeting the mansion of a famous local antique collector. The collector was known for his many strange items, and Jake decided that Halloween night, when the whole neighborhood was busy with costume parties, was the perfect opportunity to break in. He broke into the villa smoothly and collected many valuable items, antique watches, jewelry, and especially an exquisitely carved wooden box. Jake was struck by the box, not by its luxurious appearance, but by the strange energy it exuded. He felt drawn to it, as if it had an irresistible pull. Jake decided to take it home with the other items, not knowing that this one item would change his life forever. The first night after he brought the box home, Jake had a terrible nightmare. He dreamed that he was being chased through a dark forest by shapeless shadows. Whispers echoed in his head, as if hundreds of voices were cursing him at once. He woke up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding. Jake told himself it was just a stress-induced nightmare, but a sense of unease began to creep into his mind. The nightmares became more vivid over the following nights. He found himself standing among the stolen goods, surrounded by ghostly figures. Dream objects seem to come to life. An ancient clock turns backwards. The statues whispered unintelligible words, and the wooden box was always visible, ajar and emitting a cold light. Not only was it a nightmare, Jake's body also began to show strange signs. When he woke up, he discovered small scratches on his body that he couldn't remember where they came from. At first, he thought he had accidentally bumped into something in the house, but the scratches became more numerous and deeper, as if something had deliberately attacked him in his sleep. His skin became pale, his eyes sunken and dark-rimmed. Jake gradually became haggard, no longer the cunning and skillful thief he had been. He dared not sleep, because every time he fell asleep, the nightmares returned with increasing intensity. Everything in the house started to get weird. Lights turned on and off by themselves. Footsteps echoed from empty rooms. And sometimes Jake heard whispers coming from the wooden box, which now always sat in the corner of the room, no matter how many times he tried to hide it. Other objects in the house also seemed to move on their own, driving Jake crazy because he couldn't explain it. Jake begins to lose control. He can't tell what's real and what's a dream. Every time he closes his eyes, he finds himself in another world, where angry spirits surround him, dragging him down into an endless abyss. Jake knew he couldn't go on like this. He decided to confront the box and open it to end it all. As he tried to burn the box in the fireplace, Jake realized that the fire wouldn't reach it. The flames seemed to be pushed back, and the box just lay there, cold and intact. Jake's hands shook as he opened the lid. As soon as the lid was opened, a thick black smoke poured out, filling the room. In the pitch blackness, Jake saw a tall figure with white eyes and long, claw-like hands. The shadow laughed horribly and rushed at him. Jake struggled, but to no avail. The shadow whispered in his ear, "You took what was not yours. Now I will take everything that is yours." He felt his life force draining away, bit by bit. Jake was in a state of extreme panic. The scratches on his body turned into deep gashes, as if something was tearing him from the inside. Unable to bear it any longer, Jake abandoned all his possessions, including the stolen items, and left the house. Jake wandered the world, homeless and unrecognizable. Nightmares haunted him. He became emaciated, his body covered in open sores and his spirit broken. He told anyone who would listen about the cursed box that destroyed his life, but no one believed his story. A year later, the police found Jake's body in an abandoned house. His body was emaciated, covered in cuts and scratches, as if he had scratched himself until he was exhausted and breathless. In his hand was a piece of paper with his last words scrawled: "Never touch things that do not belong to you." The story of Jake and the cursed box became a terrifying urban legend passed down from generation to generation. Those who knew the story avoided any mysterious items of unknown origin, especially around Halloween, when the line between the real world and the supernatural world was at its thinnest. Footweights in the warehouse. Michael Turner is a single man in his 40s who lives in a small house in the suburbs. His life is simple and peaceful, but sometimes he feels lonely and likes to spend time cleaning and looking for old things in the shed behind his house. Tonight, he decided to check the shed to find some old items, including some family heirlooms. When Michael stepped outside, it was dark. A gentle breeze blew through the garden, rustling the leaves under his feet. He brought a flashlight because the light bulbs in the warehouse were old and the light was not bright enough. The warehouse door creaked open, making an unpleasant screeching sound. Inside, the air was damp and cold, as if it had been dormant for decades. Michael turned on his flashlight and began rummaging through the old boxes piled in the corners. The air in the warehouse was strangely cold. Even though it wasn't too cold outside, the smell of mold and dust filled his nose, making him wince. He found a few oddments' old family photos, a box of childhood toys, and a broken pocket watch. As Michael rummaged around, a soft noise came from the back of the warehouse, a sound like someone's feet stepping on a rotten wooden floor. He stopped immediately, his heart starting to beat faster. There was only one door to this warehouse, and that door was still open behind him. No one could have entered without him noticing. Michael turned his flashlight toward the sound. The light cut through the silence, but all he saw was a jumble of boxes. No one was there. He told himself he must have imagined the sound. But then the footsteps came again, slow and distinct, as if someone were moving among the boxes. Michael's heart was pounding. He held the flashlight steady, walking slowly toward the back of the warehouse. The light bulb swayed slightly from the ceiling, casting a weak, wavering light that made the shadows of the surrounding objects dance on the walls. Each time the bulb swayed, it revealed more dark corners behind the crates. An uneasy feeling filled Michael's mind, as if he were not alone in this small space. He tried to calm himself, telling himself it was probably just the wind or the creaking of wood. But the footsteps were too real heavy and steady. He pointed his flashlight in every corner, but found nothing but old boxes and cobwebs clinging to the ceiling. As he was about to turn around and go out, a loud noise rang out. Something had collapsed right behind him. He spun around and saw a large crate thrown across the floor, its contents flying everywhere. Unable to contain himself any longer, Michael rushed out of the warehouse, slamming the door behind him. He locked the door, making sure no one could get in. He told himself he needed to rest and forget about the strange things that had just happened. Back home, Michael tried to relax by watching TV, but his mind was still reeling from what had just happened. It's probably just mice, he told himself, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong in the shed. That night, Michael went to bed, but sleep did not come easily. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw images of boxes falling and the flickering light from the warehouse ceiling. He tossed and turned until he finally fell asleep. But before long, a familiar sound pulled him from his sleep, footsteps echoing through the house. Michael jumped up, his heart pounding. Footsteps echoed slowly down the hallway outside his bedroom, steady and heavy, as if someone were moving through each room of the house. He fell silent, listening. His little house had only one door, and he had locked it before going to bed. There couldn't be anyone inside unless something from the warehouse had gotten in here. Michael felt a chill of fear. He held his breath, slowly sitting up and reaching for the flashlight on the nightstand. The footsteps continued, moving from the hallway into the living room, as if someone were pacing through his house, but not quickly, but very slowly, deliberately. Michael stood up, holding the flashlight steady, and tiptoed out of the bedroom. The light from the flashlight swept across the walls, but the hallway was empty. No one was there. He could hear footsteps right in front of him, but there was no one in sight. The strange noises continued, circling the house, then gradually approaching the living room. Michael shivered and hurried into the living room. When he got there, he was stunned. The door to the back garden was open, and the light from the shed was flickering in the distance. A chill ran down Michael's spine. He knew for a fact that he had locked the shed door. How could it have been opened? Flashlight in hand, Michael stepped outside and headed toward the shed. The wind blew through the garden, making an eerie rustling sound. The warehouse door was ajar, swinging gently in the wind. The light bulb hanging inside swayed more violently than before, casting a flickering light. When Michael entered, he saw boxes scattered across the floor, overturned. But this time, amid the chaos of the items, there was a clear footprint on the dusty wooden floor, a footprint soaked with water. Michael shivered, feeling his throat dry. He knew no one had ever been in this place, so where did these footprints come from? He shined his flashlight around the warehouse and stopped in a dark corner. There, something stood, a gaunt figure, with disheveled hair and dark eyes staring at him. "You shouldn't have come back here," the figure whispered, its voice hoarse and cold as the breath of the night wind. Michael backed away in horror, but the shadow began to move forward, the footsteps slow and heavy, just like the ones he had heard before. Michael turned to run, but the warehouse door slammed shut before he could get out. Darkness swallowed everything around him, leaving only the echoing footsteps and the soft laughter of the figure behind him. He screamed, banging on the door in vain. The world seemed to spin around him, the darkness gripping his body as if trying to pull him into another space. And then, suddenly, everything went quiet. The next morning, Michael's neighbors noticed the shed door behind his house wide open. They called him several times but got no response. The police were called, and they found the shed empty, but no trace of Michael. Nothing unusual about his house either, except for one thing: wet footprints on the dusty, wooden floor led from the shed into the house and disappeared right in the middle of the living room. Michael Turner had disappeared without a trace. The haunted warehouse. Sarah Collins has just moved to a quiet suburban home after her divorce. She chose the home for its spaciousness and peaceful surroundings. Behind the house is a large shed which houses gardening tools and old items from the previous owner. Everything seems perfect for a fresh start, but she doesn't know that this house is hiding a terrible secret. One night, Sarah needed some tools to fix a leaky faucet in the kitchen. She went to the back of the shed to find some pliers. When she got inside, she turned on the light switch, but noticed that the light bulb in the ceiling was not on. Despite her annoyance, she told herself that the light bulb might be broken and used the flashlight on her phone to light her way. She quickly found the item she needed and returned home, making sure to turn off the lights and close the shed door. About 15 minutes later, while fixing the faucet, a sudden light reflecting from the kitchen window caught her attention. Looking out the window, Sarah was stunned. The light in the warehouse was on, even though she was sure it had been turned off. She stepped outside to check. The warehouse door was still locked as she had left it, and there was no one around. Feeling that something was off, but not wanting to worry too much, she turned off the lights and went back inside. That night, while reading in the living room, Sarah heard a strange noise coming from behind her. It was the sound of boxes being dragged across the storage floor. Her heart suddenly started beating fast, and she reassured herself that it was probably just the wind. The noise, however, was longer and clearer, as if someone were moving boxes inside the warehouse, slowly, deliberately. Sarah jumped up, grabbed her flashlight, and walked to the back door. The warehouse door was still locked, but this time the whisper sounded right next to her ear. Mumbled indistinct words like someone speaking from afar. Sarah froze. She turned on her flashlight and shined it through the crack in the door, but everything was intact and there was no one inside. Strange phenomena continued to occur in the following days. Sarah noticed the lights in the shed turning on by themselves several times and heard the sound of boxes being dragged whenever she was alone. The feeling of unease grew, and Sarah decided to learn more about the house and especially the shed behind it. She searched the internet and the town archives, and then a terrifying secret was revealed. Years ago, this warehouse was the site of a tragic accident. A worker was trapped inside when a stack of crates collapsed. He suffocated from his injuries before he was found. Sarah felt a chill when she learned about the accident. She wondered, is the spirit of the worker still trapped here? But despite her fear, she still wanted to find out. One night, she decided to face her fear. Sarah grabbed her flashlight and, clutching the key, walked out into the shed. That night, there was no wind, and everything was eerily quiet. She unlocked the door and pushed it open. The light inside turned on by itself, casting long, sinuous shadows on the walls. The air inside seemed thick. Sarah stepped inside, shining her flashlight around the corners, but saw nothing but piles of boxes and crates. And then the lights flickered and the boxes slowly moved, making a creepy screeching sound. Sarah backed away in horror, but the door behind her slammed shut. In the darkness, Sarah heard the whisper more clearly than ever, a hoarse, desperate voice. "Save me." Sarah froze. The ceiling light began to sway, and boxes fell across the floor as if tossed by an invisible hand. Amidst the chaos, Sarah saw a blurry figure, a man with a face contorted in pain, eyes empty, staring at her. "Save me. I can't leave here." The voice rang out again, echoing throughout the cramped space. Sarah screamed in terror. She rushed to the door, trying to open it. She pounded on it, but it wouldn't budge. The figure moved closer, and his footsteps echoed in the space, heavy and steady. In a moment of despair, Sarah squeezed her eyes shut and shouted, "I'll help you. Let me go." Immediately, the noise died down. There was no more dragging, no more whispering. The light returned to normal, and when Sarah opened her eyes, the warehouse door was wide open. She ran out, not daring to look back. The next morning, Sarah decided to leave the house for good. Before leaving, she called the local authorities to report the strange happenings in the shed. But when the police came to check, everything was normal, no sign of anyone or anything inside. Long marks on the wooden floor, as if someone had tried to get out, but never succeeded. Sarah never returned to that house. While she wasn't sure what she'd really encountered, she knew one thing: some mysteries should never be probed too deeply. And if you ever hear footsteps in the barn or see lights turn on by themselves, remember, it might not be a mechanical problem. It might be a lost soul waiting to be released. Mysterious scratch. Jack Miller, a man in his 30s, moved into an old house in the suburbs after getting a new job. The house was quite spacious and had a warehouse in the back where the previous owner left many old items. Jack thought this was the perfect start to his new life, a quiet place, not too far from the city and suited to his simple lifestyle. The first few days went smoothly. Jack was busy sorting through the house and exploring the shed, where he found some gardening tools and a few leftover antiques. He didn't pay much attention to the old space, just thought of it as a place to store odds and ends. A few days after moving in, Jack began to notice small scratches on his body. At first, they appeared on his hands and feet every morning when he woke up. He didn't think too much of it, thinking it might be a mosquito or insect bite. even though the weather wasn't hot or humid at the time. The scratches looked strange. They weren't just simple scratches, but had the shape of small handprints. As if someone with sharp nails had dug into his skin while he slept. What was even stranger was that he had no memory of what he had done to cause those injuries. As the days went by, the scratches grew more and more frequent. Every morning, Jack woke up with a burning pain in his arms and legs, and the wounds grew longer and deeper. He told himself that maybe something in the shed was the cause, because every time he went in there to find tools or clean up, more strange scratches appeared. He searched the warehouse thoroughly but found no insects or anything unusual that could have caused such injuries. However, a strange feeling began to cloud his mind. Every time he entered the warehouse, he felt like someone was watching him from the shadows, and the air inside was so stuffy that it made him shiver. One night, Jack decided to install a camera in his bedroom to see if he was unconsciously scratching himself in his sleep. When he reviewed the footage the next morning, nothing unusual happened. He slept soundly through the night and didn't move at all. However, when he woke up, new scratches appeared on his hands, this time deeper and more pronounced. Jack began to panic. How could these injuries have appeared without any apparent cause? He checked the bedroom again, finding no trace of insects or sharp objects that could have caused the scratches. At the same time, the darkness in the warehouse seemed to grow thicker. Every time Jack stepped into it, he felt as if something invisible brushed past him, making the hairs on his body stand on end. Jack's fear grew stronger and stronger. One night, he decided to bravely check the warehouse in the middle of the night, hoping to find the real cause. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, even though the creepy feeling continued to cloud his mind. The warehouse door opened with a creak. And the darkness from inside seemed to pour out, swallowing the flashlight's light. Jack stepped inside, the light sweeping over the crates and old tools. Everything seemed normal, until he saw it. There were long scratches on the floor, as if someone had used their fingernails to rake the wood. But even stranger, the scratches were unusually small, as if they had come from a child's hand. As Jack bent down to take a closer look, a cold wind blew across the back of his neck. Making him shiver. From the darkness deep inside the warehouse, a faint whisper rang out soft, almost inaudible. "We here." Jack's heart was pounding. He jumped up, spun around, and shined his flashlight everywhere, but there was no one in the warehouse but him. The old boxes lay still, and the space fell into an eerie silence. Jack rushed out, slammed the door, and locked it. But the unsettling feeling did not go away. He knew that something in the warehouse was watching him. A few days later, Jack decided never to enter the warehouse again. He hoped that by staying away from it, the strange phenomena would stop. However, the scratches continued to appear. Every morning, he woke up to new wounds on his arms and leg scratches that grew longer and deeper, like someone was trying to leave a mark on his skin. One night, while Jack was sleeping soundly, he felt a cold hand touch his neck. He jumped up, sweating all over, but there was no one in the room. The next morning, a long, deep scratch appeared on his arm, as if an invisible hand had scratched his skin in his sleep. That was the last straw. Jack couldn't take it anymore. He decided to leave the house immediately. In a panic, he packed up his things in the night and left without daring to look back at the warehouse one last time. As he got into the car, Jack felt like someone was watching him from the shadows. His heart pounded, and he revved the engine, driving away from there as fast as he could. Jack never returned to that house. He sold it for a pittance to an unknown buyer and never spoke of what happened. But sometimes, on rainy nights, he felt a sharp pain in his arm, as if invisible scratches were still clinging to him long after he had left. And if you happen to walk into an old barn, remember, there are invisible things waiting, and they never want you to leave easily. Emily had always loved the quiet of her small cabin in the woods in Oregon. Nestled among tall trees, far from the hustle and bustle of the city, the house was the perfect place for her to immerse herself in books and silence. But there were nights when the quiet made her uneasy. It was such a night today. Outside, cold winds blew through the trees, making rustling sounds like whispers. Emily sat on the sofa, her book open, but her mind was no longer focused on the content. The pages gradually became blurred in the warm yellow light of the room. The feeling that something was wrong outside made her unable to take her eyes off the window. She reached out to pick up the hot cup of tea, trying to dispel the anxiety that was rising in her heart. But as her eyes swept past the transparent glass, she suddenly saw something moving outside the window. Her heart beat faster, and a creepy feeling spread throughout her body. Emily took a deep breath, trying to convince herself that it was just an illusion. But the silence around her only added to the tension. Looking outside again, she saw a white blur gliding between the trees. Eyes wide, Emily stood up, unable to resist curiosity and fear. She walked closer to the window, where the dim light of the desk lamp was not enough to illuminate the darkness outside. The scene became magical, but also full of horror. Suddenly, a strong wind blew through, causing the window to shake. Emily jumped back, and suddenly, she saw a woman standing at the window, only a layer of glass away from her. The woman was wearing an old white dress, her long hair hanging down to her shoulders. Her eyes were empty, as if there was no soul. It was hard to believe, but it seemed like the woman was looking straight at Emily, her eyes unblinking, without any expression. Emily's heart stopped. She couldn't speak. All she could do was stand there, frozen, not daring to move. The woman stood there silently for a long moment before slowly turning around and disappearing into the darkness. Panic filled her, and Emily rushed out to check. She opened the window, and there was no one outside, just darkness and rustling leaves. It's just an illusion, she told herself, but her heart was still pounding. She returned to the living room, looking around to make sure no one was there. As she turned around, a sudden chill came over her, as if there was a cold breath behind her. Emily felt that something was wrong, and when she looked at the reflection in the mirror, her heart skipped a beat. In the mirror, the figure of that woman appeared again, this time standing right behind her, so close that she could feel her presence. No, Emily screamed, but her own voice came out as a whisper. She turned around, but the living room was completely empty. Panic shook her. She began searching for safety in every corner of the house, hoping that she could escape this nightmare. Suddenly, the lights in the room started flickering and strange sounds were heard. It was as if someone was knocking on the door. Emily carefully approached the main door, her hands shaking as she opened it. No one was there, but the light outside was dim, the moonlight hidden by dark clouds. As she turned around, a cold feeling enveloped her, and a whispering voice came from behind. "You shouldn't be here." Emily felt a chill down her spine. She turned around, but only saw pitch black darkness. She backed away, her foot hitting a chair, causing it to fall to the floor with a loud thud. Panicking, she rushed into her bedroom and slammed the door shut. She leaned against it, breathing heavily. Images of the pale-faced woman kept swirling through her mind. Why her? Emily wondered, why was she in her house? She closed her eyes, trying to calm herself. It was just an illusion, she repeated. But when she opened them again, she saw a white figure standing in the middle of the room, caught in the light from the window. In disbelief, Emily rushed out of the room, but the door suddenly refused to open. "Let go!" She screamed, but there was no response, only terrifying silence. She used all her strength to push the door open and finally managed to open it. Emily ran out, not knowing where she was running to, just hoping to escape that terrifying ghost. She ran through the woods, branches whipping at her face. She didn't dare look back, but she felt like someone was following her. Every step made her panic more and more. I have to get out of here, she told herself. But her heart was pounding, and fear was slowly taking over her mind. She stopped, gasping for breath. Suddenly, a voice called out from behind her, and when she turned around, the woman was standing in the middle of the road, staring straight at her with empty eyes. Emily felt as if everything around her had stopped. Time had frozen. She knew she couldn't run forever. The woman began to move closer, and Emily felt a strong pull at her. "You shouldn't leave this place," the voice said in a whisper, cold and mysterious. "This house needs you." "No, I don't belong here," Emily cried out, but the woman only smiled, her eyes glinting strangely. She couldn't take it anymore. Emily turned and ran towards the house. When she entered, she felt a cold wind blowing, as if someone had just passed by her. She ran straight to the living room and locked the door. Her heart was pounding. She leaned against the door, breathing heavily. But this peace didn't last long. Once again, the doorbell rang, and Emily knew that she couldn't just avoid it forever. She gathered all her courage, decided to face this terrifying thing. Emily opened the door, and a shadow suddenly rushed in. She saw the woman standing there, her eyes no longer blank, but dark. "You have to stay with me," she said, her voice different, as if some force was pulling her. The fear turned to helplessness. Emily felt drawn into those eyes. "Why?" she asked, but her voice sounded weak and frightened. "To know the truth," the woman replied. "This house has been forgotten. It needs a new soul to revive." "No, I can't," Emily cried out, but her legs had no strength left. She felt as if she were being buried in the woman's memories. Mark is a young man who has just moved into a new house in the suburbs of New York City. The house is spacious, with white walls and open spaces, making him feel like this would be the perfect place to start a new chapter in his life. But the quiet of the place sometimes makes him feel lonely. One night, Mark was working late at his computer, the light from the screen creating a hazy atmosphere around him. The sound of typing on the keyboard became the soundtrack to the silence of the house. But in the midst of his concentration, a sudden noise came from the bedroom door. The door creaked, as if someone was trying to open it. Mark looked up, his eyes glued to the door. It must be the wind, he told himself, trying to keep going. But a few minutes later, the sound came again, this time clearer, as if someone was standing on the other side of the door. With a nervous feeling, Mark stood up and walked towards the door. As he placed his hand on the doorknob, a sudden blast of cold air swept past, making him shiver. "It's probably just the wind," he consoled himself and opened the door. The room was dark. No one was inside. Mark took a deep breath, trying to shake off the feeling of fear. He turned and was about to close the door, but a faint moan came from inside the room, making him stop. Heart pounding, he stepped into the room. The air in the room was cold, and the dim light from the nightlight created strange patterns on the walls. Mark walked to the center of the room, but felt like someone was watching him. He turned around, but saw only a dark reflection in the mirror. A feeling of dread rose up in him, and as he stepped out of the room, the door suddenly slammed shut behind him. "Okay, just a hallucination," Mark whispered to himself. He decided to go back to his desk, but he couldn't concentrate. Strange sounds kept echoing in his head, as if something was waiting. As the night grew late, Mark decided to go to sleep. But as he lay in bed, the sound of the bedroom door rang again. The door slowly opened, but there was no one there. His heart beat faster, and he decided to get out of bed to check. This time, when he entered the bedroom, the light from the night light gave off a strange feeling. Mark looked around. Everything seemed normal. But when he went to the mirror, a blurry figure flashed right behind him. He turned around, but the room was completely empty. His heart stopped for a moment. Enough. He shouted, but there was no answer. He walked out of the room, determined not to return. But the following nights, nothing changed. The bedroom door still opened automatically. Strange noises still rang out, and Mark began to feel uneasy. He tried to find out what was wrong with this house. Searching the internet, he discovered that this house had belonged to a previous family, and they had mysteriously disappeared. Curiosity got the better of Mark. He decided to ask his neighbors about the history of the house. His neighbor, an older woman named Mrs. Henderson, seemed very careful when talking about the house. "Don't mess with it," she said in a serious tone. "This house has seen strange things. The previous family's bedroom door would open by itself, and they never found their daughter." V. Mark felt a chill run down his spine. "The girl?" he asked. "Yes, she went missing when she was little, and no one has seen her since." "This house has always had a dark aura," Mrs. Henderson said, her eyes becoming distant. Mark felt a surge of anxiety. He decided to go back and check the bedroom again. When he got home, he felt the atmosphere in the house was different. There was tension. When he opened the bedroom door, it opened automatically, as if waiting for him. He stepped inside, and this time, there was more than darkness. The faint scent of jasmine filled the air. "Just my imagination," he told himself. But when he looked in the mirror, he saw a shadowy figure standing right behind him. His heart pounded. He turned, but the room was empty. A feeling of panic took over. "Is anyone here?" he shouted. The answer was an eerie silence. Mark decided to leave the room and lock the door. But as soon as he closed the door, a knocking sound came from the other side, incessant. The unease returned. "Enough!" he shouted, but the knocking only grew louder. He turned around, but there was nothing but silence. Panting, he decided to call a close friend, David, to tell him what was going on. David arrived immediately, but as he entered the house, the strange feeling seemed to permeate the place. "Is there anything strange about this house?" David asked as they sat in the living room. "A lot," Mark sighed. "The bedroom door opens by itself, strange noises, and there's a figure I saw." David raised an eyebrow, curiosity clear in his eyes. "Do you want to check it out?" "Is there anything strange about this house?" David asked as they sat in the living room. "A lot," Mark sighed. "The bedroom door opens by itself, strange noises, and there's a figure I saw." David raised an eyebrow, curiosity clear in his eyes. "Do you want to check it out?" Mark hesitated, but curiosity overcame his fear. They both decided to go back to the bedroom. When they opened the door, it opened automatically again, but this time, Mark had the feeling that something was waiting inside. They entered the room, and the dim light from the nightlight cast strange shadows on the walls. Mark felt a chill run down his spine. "Did you see that?" he whispered. David nodded, but said nothing. They moved closer to the mirror, and when they looked into it, they saw the silhouette of a little girl with long hair and big eyes standing right behind them. "No, no," Mark shouted, turning around but seeing no one. "We have to get out of here," he said, but David didn't react. He stood still, mesmerized by the image in the mirror. Suddenly, the door to the room slammed shut, causing both of them to jump. "What the hell?" David shouted, hastily trying to open the door, but it was locked. Mark's heart was pounding like a drum, the feeling of dread growing. "We have to find a way out of here," he said, but no one heard. In his despair, a laugh rang out from the room, a sweet but mysterious voice. "Play with me." Mark and David looked at each other, their eyes filled with panic. They turned around, and the little girl's figure appeared more clearly, standing in the middle of the room, her eyes innocent yet filled with mystery. "Let me go," Mark shouted, but the girl just smiled, saying nothing. From behind, Mark felt a cold air, as if someone was standing close by. "We can't stay here much longer," David said, trying to open the door again, but couldn't. Suddenly, the girl came toward them. "I just want to play," she said, her voice as clear as the sound of dewdrops. "Play with me." Mark's heart sank. "We can't play," he said. "We have to go." But now the girl was right in front of them, her face full of innocence, but her eyes reflected a deep sadness. "I just want friends," she said, and Mark felt a pang of pity. "We'll be friends," Mark said, his voice shaking. "But we can't stay here." She looked at him, and there was silence. Finally, she smiled. "Fine, but you won't forget me, will you?" Mark felt drawn to her eyes. "No, I won't," he replied, though he was panicking inside. Suddenly, the door opened, as if in response to his promise. They rushed out, not daring to look back. When they got outside, they both collapsed to the ground, their hearts still pounding. "We have to get out of here now," David said, his voice shaking. Mark nodded, saying nothing. They ran out of the house, not once looking back. But as they turned, Mark heard laughter echoing from inside the house, a sweet but mysterious sound. "Don't forget me," her voice rang out, a haunting reminder. They kept running until darkness enveloped the forest. When they reached David's house, Mark knew he had escaped the strange house, but the image of the little girl was still imprinted in his mind. Even though he had left, a part of him knew that the haunting of her would never go away, and the memories of that house would always haunt him in his dreams. Perched on a small hill in the middle of a vast Texas field, there is an old house that has existed for over 100 years. With its shabby tile roof and faded wooden walls, this house once belonged to a wealthy family, but was abandoned after a terrible tragedy. As time passed, the story of the house was forgotten until Jane and her husband, Mike, decided to buy it to start a new life in the peaceful suburbs. Jane has always loved old houses with old charm. When she saw the house at an estate sale, she was immediately drawn to it. The house had the old world atmosphere she was looking for, and with the sale price being much lower than expected, they couldn't pass up the opportunity. Mike, initially hesitant, agreed with Jane after considering the factors. They thought it would be a great place to raise a family. After moving in, they began to decorate and renovate the house. The house was spacious, with a large living room and an old wooden rocking chair next to the fireplace. Jane was particularly fond of this chair. It had an antique feel, reminding her of her childhood when she used to sit in her grandmother's rocking chair. But Mike, despite being a practical person, felt that there was something strange about it. He often teased Jane, calling it the haunted chair. The story begins when Mike goes away on a business trip for a week, and Jane is home alone. The first night Mike is away, everything is normal. Jane enjoys a quiet evening, reading and listening to music. But the second night, strange things start to happen. Around midnight, Jane was lying in bed, almost asleep when she suddenly heard a noise coming from downstairs. It was a soft, steady, familiar sound, the sound of something rocking. She opened her eyes, listened carefully, and realized it was the rocking chair. Jane thought to herself that perhaps the wind had blown in through the window and made the chair shake. But then she remembered that the window had been closed before she went to bed. She felt a cold shiver run down her spine, but tried not to panic. Jane decided to go down to check. As she walked up the creaking wooden stairs, Jane felt more and more nervous. When she reached the living room, the rocking chair was swaying slowly, as if someone was sitting on it, pushing it gently with their feet. But there was no one in the room. There was no wind, nothing that could move the chair. Feeling a chill, Jane quickly turned off the light and returned to her bedroom. She tried to convince herself that it was just a normal phenomenon, maybe the uneven wooden floor or something natural. She closed her eyes and forced herself to sleep, but could not forget the image of the chair rocking in the dark. The rocking continued in the following nights. Sometimes Jane heard it just as she was falling asleep. Sometimes it woke her up in the middle of the night. She went down to the living room several times to check, and each time she found the rocking chair slowly swaying in the dark, but there was no sign of who or what was behind it. Jane began to feel uneasy. One morning, she decided to investigate the house. During her research, she discovered that the house had belonged to a wealthy family in the early 20th century. The wife of this family had died in a tragic accident, and afterward, her husband had spent the rest of his life sitting in a rocking chair near the fireplace, remembering his dead wife. He died in this very chair after suffering a stroke one winter night. The story of the man in the chair's death sent a chill down Jane's spine. She began to feel that something was wrong with the house and the rocking chair. But she still didn't want to tell Mike about her experiences, afraid that he would think she was imagining things or being influenced by old stories. One night, as Jane sat in the living room reading, she decided to face her fear. The rocking chair sat quietly in the corner of the room, as if challenging her. Jane stared at it, trying to find any sign that it would start rocking again. She even tried sitting on the chair, but nothing happened. Everything was quiet and normal, as if the strange phenomena were just a figment of her imagination. But just as she stood up and was about to leave the room, the chair began to shake. Not slowly like before, but violently, shaking each time as if someone was sitting on it angrily. Jane stood there, unable to believe her eyes. Before her eyes, the chair was moving at a furious speed, and once again, there was no one in the room but her. The rocking sound of the chair echoed throughout the quiet house. Jane panicked. She rushed upstairs, slammed the bedroom door and hid under the covers like a child, but she could not sleep. The rocking sound continued to resound steadily, as if the chair was trying to communicate something to her. The next morning, Mike returned. Jane, exhausted and scared, finally told her husband about what she had been through over the past week. At first, Mike laughed and said that it was just Jane being too stressed. But when he saw her pale face and dark circles under her eyes from lack of sleep, he began to believe that something was really wrong. Mike decided to check the chair out for himself. He sat down, gave it a little push, and it rocked like a normal rocking chair. Nothing out of the ordinary happened. But as soon as he stood up and turned away, the chair rocked again, slowly and vaguely, like a haunting goodbye. After that, both Jane and Mike decided to move the chair out of the house, not wanting it to continue haunting them. They took the chair to a nearby antique shop and never looked back. From the day the chair left the house, the strange phenomena also disappeared. The house became quiet as before, and Jane gradually felt at peace again. But every time she thought about that rocking chair, a cold feeling still ran down her spine. The antique shop owner said the chair was quickly sold to an antiques enthusiast. Little did they know that it carried with it the story of a dead man and the secrets that house held. And since then, the rocking chair has continued to rock, but this time in another house, waiting for someone to sit on it and discover its secrets. If you find the story interesting, please like and subscribe to wait for the next video.